Hey there, folks! Now, this review is actually a long time in the making, since I've been following Glassheart Games' brutal Metroidvania, Vigil the Longest Night, for, well, a while. That said, I was made aware that there were sizable chunks of upcoming content, and so I, grudgingly, held my breath and waited. Anyways, that brings us to now, and as far as I know, it's feature complete, which means it's time to ask those important questions. Like, was this a title to look out for, or did this Vigil make me want to vamoose? I'm your host, Arlian. Let's find out together. It's been countless years since the sun was last seen, its radiance long removed by the eldritch event known as the Longest Night. This endless twilight saw swaths of species wither and die, while beckoning forward a nightmarish host of aberrations. Confront this strange new world, the Vigil was formed, a secretive order of warriors who serve as humanity's bulwark against these terrible threats. You take the role of Layla, a member of this now dwindling order, tasked with investigating the strange occurrences overtaking our hometown, hopefully before her twin sister can be pulled into the grim happenings. While this serves well enough to introduce the basic premise of Longest Night, it hints at the larger scope of the game's story, at best. Vigil is one of those titles that definitely benefits from searching every nook it has available, and deep diving into its lore to get the most out of its story, with its world gradually growing all the more mysterious and uncanny with every new kernel of knowledge you unearth. And there is a lot to do in order to get those tidbits, such as optional subquests to pursue that show you different sides of characters, or lead you to hidden nooks rife with mysterious secrets. I, wasn't really diligent about these my first run through, and both locked myself out and just plain missed a number of these quests, and by extension on several segments of the game, which in turn essentially helped expedite my path towards the worst possible ending, given I then chose to trust someone who I really shouldn't have. I'm not gonna lie, I walked away a little bit confused with the experience and what I'd found, and a slew of questions about the game's narrative and how I was supposed to make sense of it. Especially given the game's transition between its prologue act and the main game, because seriously, the transition between these acts is jarring in a sense, and left me with more of a looming sense of, "Buh?" I felt like I had to be missing something, which is a large part of why I began a far more meticulous deep dive into the game's guts. Every side quest I'd missed, every nook explored, and the notes and flavor text, I pored over all of these as though it was a scholastic endeavor. I was on a narrative-oriented rampage, and I'm not gonna lie, when I finally unearthed what I think was the explanation for a burning question, I'd had such a satisfying aha moment, just because of how goddamn hidden it was. Fucking flavor text. And yet, between it and the altogether satisfying yet tragic conclusion of the game's proper route, I'd obtained my ending. Sure, it bottomed out my guts with each new discovery, but it also provided satisfying answers to the conundrums that had been bouncing around in my brain. So, I definitely dig that, and if you're a big fan of theory crafting and hunting down tidbits needed to piece together a narrative, you'll likely dig this process too. Still, there's a lot more to Vigil than its narrative. In fact, I was legitimately surprised just how much the game had hidden in it, despite its nature as a Metroidvania. Heck, the prologue isn't really all that massive, and yet I wound up discovering so much more once again poring over Vigil's content more methodically. Which segued into being outright overwhelmed for a bit when I realized the first act was essentially a tutorial compared to the second act, as it made me pretty darn grateful that the game's save points also double as fast travel systems, since that helped a lot for getting from one end of the map to the other in a timely fashion. Especially since the sheer gamut of side quests and secrets to find will have you bouncing all over the place if you're like me and want to unearth everything and locate all the secrets it has to offer. Thankfully, my second playthrough was a hell of a lot forgiving than my first, even despite the fact that it ramps up the difficulty, given I got to keep my map completion, allowing me to scoot about the areas a bit more efficiently. It also helped a lot with secret hunting, since it marks points of interest from save points to locked doors, and secrets, though admittedly tracking the secrets requires discovering a certain spell first. That wasn't my only saving grace, though. because I also got to keep all the navigation abilities I discovered during my first playthrough, allowing me to tackle the content more efficiently than I would have otherwise. I also stressed the abilities I found, since ultimately realized there's even more to uncover off the beaten trail, which is part of how I wound up missing so much of the second act. Such as the hidden bonus areas associated with the trio of Orcarinas, which attested me, mostly because they flew in the face of what the game had already established. For one thing, you don't get a map for these areas, which is incredibly painful given they're generally pretty extensive. And you also don't get any save points, which is a lot more miserable than you'd think. And I'm not just saying that because these areas are replete with instant death, highly damaging traps, and lethal enemies, though that certainly fucking contributes. See, the reason these areas gall me, more or less, is the very same reason I've avoided calling this game a Souls-like, which I'm sure some of you folks in the audience may have noticed at this point. And that's not to say I don't think it's influenced. Vigil proudly wears those influences on its sleeve like a badge of honor for the most part. Obfuscating lore elements? Check. Stamina-based combat? Check. Exploration? Gotcha. Bastard difficult? You know it. And yet, it's on this point where I feel the need to also split hairs, given while The Longest Night certainly embraces the challenges and viciousness that Souls-likes have to offer, it lacks the key sense of forgiveness inherent in their design. Just let me explain. See, where Souls-like games will happily murder the player, there's a sort of intrinsic safety net built into the framework. When you die, you're not actually losing what is potentially hours of gameplay, given you still get to keep gear and key items you find, as well as the occasional shortcuts you've uncovered. Frankly, the game can afford to be ruthless to you, because even if you die horrendous death due to a lapse in caution, you're mostly taxed in experience, which you can then recover. This isn't the case in Vigil, though. In its case, every reckless error or sacrifice of defense in the name of Fashion Souls brings you that much closer to a game over screen, risking every bit of progress you've made since the last time you've saved. Given the game's base difficulty and gravity still being a complete boss in itself, it can be incredibly frustrating at times. Frankly, I lost count of just how many times I wound up backtrapping to a save point just to save after finding a key item or upgrade rather than risking losing it at all. Yes, you do have a spell that lets you go back to a save point, but then that respawns everything that you've killed, so you're just going right back to the same rigmarole all over again. There are some forgiving elements, admittedly. For one thing, you can tweak the difficulty up or down, which is pretty nice in itself, but really shines when you consider how much the difficulty ramps up in New Game Plus. What's more, there's even items that let you save whenever you want. But in the latter case, these are limited to what you can find, so I wound up mostly saving them for the you're going to get fucked fests that are the mapless, saveless bonus areas I talked about earlier. And even then, I was still hesitant to use these because I also discovered that these items doubled as the currency needed to respec your character. To be frank, most of mine were actually spent this way because Vigil's combat and character building system afforded a delightful amount of flexibility, and I found myself really compelled to try out a variety of different strategies. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, first off, leveling in Vigil works a little bit differently than what you'd expect in a Souls-like or something inspired by one. For one thing, when you gain enough experience, you level up immediately and fully heal to boot. Forgiveness there, a lot. What's more, you don't gain stat points. You gain skill points in order to flesh out your character's capabilities, both in a general tree full of passive abilities, as well as a corte of weapon-focused skill trees. Whilst you can divvy up points between the trees, I generally found it more beneficial to stuff as many points as possible into my primary tree and dabble from there, since they considerably flesh out your otherwise bare-bones movesets. I mean, yes, some of the weapons you do find have unique passives, and even input command that's unique to them that gives them a little special attack, but by and large, the bread and butter of your gameplay will be found in the skill tree for the weapon you prefer. In my case, this meant using the heaviest wad of armor I could slap on and heavy weapons, since not only did they hit like a train, they also had a weapon available to them that regenerates health on hit. And since heavy weapons also have a rapid hitting spin attack, well look, it's cheesy, but not taking much damage because of heavy armor and then gaining back the damage I do take, it works. And meant that even when I emptied out my stamina bar and found myself locked in a surprisingly lengthy vulnerability animation, I could still bounce back from my mistake pretty easily. That said, the game's flexibility did mean I could be tempted away from that and to actually try out the other weapons. Swords, for instance, are solid defensive weapons with a decent moveset, the eventual ability to reflect projectiles, and a devastating parry that was altogether forgiving to land. Plus, one of the other swords let me be a discount Vigil and obliterate an entire screen's worth of enemies by drawing my sword. And yes, I did try out daggers and bows, but I mostly just ended up using the daggers for some platforming malarkey and didn't really care for bows other than the mechanical one. That said, your character builds hardly end at your skills. I'm not just talking about the ability to plunk your skill points into stats like % damage on hit when you roll around in New Game Plus. Even if that is broken as fuck. Seriously, just twin daggering someone and taking away chunks of their max health on every hit is pretty great. But, no, see, the game also has an item upgrading system, which, okay, the upgrading itself is pretty basic, but the enchanting system is less so. Being able to cause every enemy hit by your sword to catch fire is devastating, especially when you're hitting everything on the screen and then some. % life drain with a fast-hitting axe or dagger? Golden. Though, I think the biggest amount of fun I actually had was the enchantment that allowed me to convert my defense into bonus unarmed damage. Because yes, one of the things that was added to Vigil after I picked up the game again was a somewhat fleshed out unarmed system. While it doesn't have a skill tree to accompany it, it also doesn't really need one, since I was able to punch a giant demon frog boss in the ass so hard it croaked. I'm not sorry. Anyways, my editor's a Philistine. The point is that I've maybe gone on about this a bit too long, so let's mosey on to the aesthetics. And I'm not even gonna lie, my first introduction to Vigil was some of the clips of the gameplay, and even early on, its development, I thought it looked rad. Looked rad as hell. It's got a really distinctive look to it, with some fantastically morbid design for both the world and the enemies you encounter. Plus, you can engage in some pretty great bits of Fashion Souls. What's more, the music is fucking phenomenal. There's just so many areas and boss themes that got me feeling hype when they started to play. Such as this bad boy. They honestly felt like love letters to Castlevania and give me the same sort of warm fuzzies. Which, with all that said, we're at the finale, and I have to say that this review is literally and figuratively a long time coming. And I need to clarify what I've said by this when I said it in the intro and now. In fact, I'd initially been introduced to Vigil shortly after its release, and when I'd given it a look back then, I had some decidedly mixed feelings on it. And yet, given that I've been told that there was a lot of changes coming soon, I figured I'd take a step back and wait for that update to hit. This didn't go quite as well as I'd hoped, given that my controller then decided to no longer work with the game. So TLDR, I was left twiddling my thumbs and waiting while this review gathered dust. Until this most recent patch hit. Finally, I was able to actually finish my initial playthrough, and yet, that was hardly enough for me. With all the changes they'd made to the gameplay and all the questions I had about the story, I felt all but obliged to do a victory lap and to run through the New Game Plus as thoroughly as possible. It hooked me so much that I wanted to see everything the game had to offer me. And I'll be frank, the wait was well worth it. All the various additions to the game, all the balance fixes, all the neat additions, like unarmed moveset being so good it actually could carry me through New Game Plus. They vastly improved the gameplay side of things, and it went from a flawed but fun experience to something a whole lot more magical for me. Also, longswords no longer being gimped piles of garbage was nice. Anyways, this essentially became something that grew more profound as I grew more immersed with its narrative and overall world. Essentially, when I put down Vigil, I felt satisfied, which is why I can genuinely say I recommend this game as an immensely solid hit. At the end of the day, the delay that hit this review wound up being for the best, since the current iteration is a lot of fun to run through. But yeah, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of you folks for actually bearing with me. Thank you for tuning in, and if you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me about the review, feel free to comment. And if you have an interest in supporting my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell to notice a new release. There's also a Discord, links in the description. You can go part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. I have a Twitch at www.twitch.tv/Arlian. And yeah, I mean, if you have a suggestion for a game you'd like to see me try, feel free to also leave that in the comments. But otherwise, I'll catch you in the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.